joined us on this Congress, first online Congress that we ever did. And hello to all the listeners and viewers across the globe that have found one of our live streams and are participating, or at least listening to our panel session, first panel session of this online council. And just some opening words from my side. My name is Thomas Waits. I'm a member of the European Parliament and the co-chair of the European Greens, and by the way, an organic farmer and beekeeper in Austria. And so today we are focusing very much on the world, how it could look like after COVID, the post-COVID world. And you know, we're all in a collective crisis experience where we find each other. And through this, basic needs of citizens, basic needs of society become much more visible than they used to be just half a year ago. Whether we talk about security of food production, whether we talk about proper healthcare systems that deliver, or if they're not there, don't deliver anymore, or if we talk about easy, accessible medication and vaccines for fairly everyone on the globe. And also, we are also shown that society is able to react in a very fast manner if it finds itself in a crisis. And in fact, we're not just in a COVID crisis in the moment, but still an ongoing in a climate crisis, in a crisis where we meet the boundaries of our planet, where we meet the boundaries of nature use and nature abuse. So we invited speakers from all over the globe to reflect on the situation, to give us their impressions and their views on how a post-COVID world can look like and should look like. And for this, we invited some very interesting speakers from across the globe, and I will now present them to you in the row as they are going to speak. First, we will hear Vandana Shiva. She's an Indian citizen. She may be known to many of you as a forefront fighter for feminism, for seed saving, for support of local farming and small and medium-sized farms. She's a seed saver. She runs an agency. All the rest you can look up in the internet or just listen to what she has to say. Next, we will hear Bill McKibben. He's the founder of 350.org, which is, I would say, the US climate protection NGO. He's one of the longest standing fighters, arguers, explainers of the climate crisis we're in, and he will give his contribution. We will not see his video because he's currently staying in the mountains, in the forests of Vermont, where the internet connection is quite low. So you will maybe see him for some seconds, but then only be able to listen to his speech. After that, we will hear Amy Goodman. Amy Goodman, one of the founders of Democracy Now!, a daily TV news channel which serves us with direct news, not just from US, but from over the globe, directly pointing their light on the social crisis, the environmental crisis, the democracy crisis that we have around the globe. If you like to watch real substantial media, I can just recommend go to Amy Goodman's channel, Democracy Now! She's gonna deliver a speech here today. And then I am coming to Professor Ilaria Capua. She is an Italian citizen. She is also known for her time in Italian politics, but now basically dealing on research on influenza, on zoonotic diseases. She's currently the director of the University of Florida's One Health Center, and she's going to talk about all these links to healthcare systems, but also to the question, what do these zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 that we have now have to do with the way we live and the way we share the planet or do not share the planet with other living beings. And last but not least, we have the pleasure to have Reinhard Bütikofer here. Reinhard Bütikofer, former co-chair of the European Green, member of the European Parliament, and our leading person in the Foreign Policy Committee, very outspoken on the European-China relations. to tackle the global geopolitical frame of what we see in the moment than delivering his speech. After that, we have an opportunity to have a Q&A with you listeners here on the first online European Greens Council. So I will not abuse any more time and hand over directly to Vandana Shiva. Welcome to our conference, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Greetings to all of you, to Bill, to Amy, to Ilaria, to Reinhard, and everyone who is there at the Green Council meeting, and everyone who's listening in. I have always been a close friend of the Greens because they never fragmented their politics. They didn't work in a silo. The Greens always connected sustainability, justice, and peace. And given that we are not just in the COVID moment, but we are also in the moment of protests all over the world against colonialism and racism, because racism is a child of colonialism because of the killing of George Floyd. I think it's good to remember that we've had planetary civilizations. We've had international trade. My country was 25% of the world's economy till the British decided they wanted to control our wealth. And the East India Company was created in 1600. And when I started to work on globalization, on the WTO agreements, the GATT, I realized basically we were seeing a return of globalization. And this return of globalization brought back every ill of the colonial period, amplified many times more because the speed of everything had been increased with fossil fuels. The three agreements, and there are only 3 additional agreements in the GATT of the Uruguay round, are all targeted at our daily bread, our food, which is connected to our health. There's the intellectual property agreement. I call it the Monsanto agreement because Monsanto admitted they drafted it. And this shaped my work on saving seeds because I did not accept the illusion that seed is a machine and it's Monsanto's invention. The second agreement was the agreement on agriculture, drafted by Cargill. The Cargill vice president was deputed to head the negotiations for the US government. And the third agreement, which is called the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, pretending to be about a health and safety, is in fact a junk food agreement drafted by the Pepsis and Cokes and the Nestle's of the world to destroy local food systems and impose industrial standards of bad food that has spread chronic diseases worldwide. So if we look at the deregulation of commerce, just for the food businesses and the agriculture businesses, what are we seeing in terms of the COVID crisis? That this food system, which I call an anti-food system because it's not providing food to people, 1 billion people are hungry all the time, and COVID has added another 250 million to this, and predicting, and the World Food Programme is predicting 300,000 will die everywhere. So people are not getting food. It is a greed program, and it has invaded into forests. 300 of the new infectious diseases, including the corona, are all a result of our invasions into forests and not respecting ecosystems' boundaries. But the impact of corona gets amplified because the same junk food industrial food system is responsible for chronic diseases. Another pandemic. Millions are dying every year because of cancer, 1.9 million every year because of diabetes. And if you have these pre-existing conditions, there's a higher chance that you'll die of corona too. Look at the inequality that this has created. So many of the big billionaires of today, the richest, Jeff Bezos, didn't exist in 1995. Bill Gates got concessions on transfer of information, and they're trying in the WTO to get even more liberalization on trade in data, trade in information. In 2010, there were 388 billionaires. This number came down to 177 in 2011, down to 62 in 2016, 8 in 2017, and the last I looked, there were 5 billionaires controlling half the wealth of the world. This inequality is injustice. And the same processes that invade into ecosystems and take away nature's share of regenerating her resources, of recycling her carbon, her nitrogen, her water, are systems that push large numbers off the land, push large numbers out of work, and create injustice. But these systems at their root are based on violence. I have always said the globalized greed economy is a war against the earth, but it is also a war against people. And we have to stop these wars, because not only are they taking lives through disease epidemics, they are taking lives through hunger. They're taking lives through robbing people of their right to work. 1.9 billion people are going to lose work because of the lockdown, of the 3.3 billion working people, according to the ILO. In terms of food and agriculture and climate, most of the time people just look at the agriculture operations narrowly. But since I started to work on ecology and ecological research and ecological activism in the early 70s, I realized it's not enough to look at a fragment of an economic system. It's not enough to look at a fragment of a technology system. You have to look at entire systems, entire energy systems, entire food systems. So if you look at the climate impact of this industrial food system, as I wrote in Soil Not Oil, it's approximately 45 to 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions, 11 to 15 coming from direct production, including use of synthetic fertilizers. But the land use change of invading into the Amazon, 110 million acres gone in Brazil and Argentina, the expansion of GMO soya, 123 million hectares to destroy our food systems and create hunger and destroy our biodiversity. This is between 15 to 18%. Processing, transport, 1 kilogram of food transported is 10 kilogram of CO2 emissions. Packaging with aluminum and plastic and styrofoam, food miles, retail, all add up to another 20%. And then because this long distance system creates waste, up to 5% is thrown away, which could feed people. On the health pandemic and the chronic diseases, the industrial globalized food system is a disease creating system. It's an unemployment creating system. It's a poverty creating system. So as we think of the resiliences we must create, we of course have to rejuvenate the ecological resilience of the earth, both at the planetary level by respecting our planetary boundaries, but also at the level of local ecosystems. And my work in Navdanya over the last 33 years has shown that the more you take care of the earth systems, the more food you get, the more creative work is created, the more biodiversity. We have 6 times more pollinators on our farms. We have more earthworms and bees. Biodiversity flourishes when you take care of biodiversity, because biodiversity loves biodiversity, just as life loves life. We have to create economic resilience, because I think the single biggest challenge we are going to face with the lockdown is the destruction of livelihoods, the destruction of economies. And we don't have to try and create old economies, they'll never come there. But the new economies can have their own massive footprints. That's why we must start to look at whole systems. You know, when people just think, oh, digital, Mr. Gates talks about dematerializing the world. But digital world is not a dematerialized world. Let me just run through some figures for you. A digital economy is very energy intensive and is responsible for already 4% of greenhouse gases. Data traffic is very energy intensive, is already using 55% of the energy used in digital. And if we think of everyone hooked into this system, I think for the Greens, it's extremely important to start looking at the social and ecological impacts of the digitalization, but also the political impacts, because part of what globalization did through deregulated trade was really rob people of their democracy, their local individual sovereignties and the sovereignty of the countries and their constitutions. WTO said we are going to be the constitution of the world, but of course it's now the constitution of the billionaires, and they want to put it in intensive care because they don't even need a multilateral agreement anymore. I think it is time to move from the mechanical mind to an ecological mind, because all the mischief is coming from thinking mechanically, which also shapes extractive economies as the only economies we can have. When circular economies, and not just recycling of waste, that's a misinterpretation of circular economies. Means carbon gets recycled locally and at the planetary level. Nitrogen gets recycled locally and at the planetary level. And if we do this, we can actually pull out all the excess carbon dioxide and all the excess nitrogen while creating more work for hands, while creating healthy food for all and more resilient economies. The last thing I would like to say, and this was my message for Environment Day, is post-COVID-19, let's regenerate the economy with the consciousness that all lives are precious, all lives are equal. We are part of one earth, we are one earth family, and there is no place for illusions of superiority, either superiority of humans over other living beings, or superiority of some colors and some absence of pigmentation over other colors, or some gender, one gender over others, or one religion over others. This is a violent system, and we must end this violence. We are ecological, biological beings. Working is our right and our meaning. Our bodies have been turned into dead matter. We need to reclaim our bodies. We need to reclaim them because the next mine is both a genetic mine as well as a data mine of our body activity and our brain functions and our thinking. At the heart of being human is care for the earth and for each other. We realized in COVID that the care economy was the most essential. But it isn't just in healthcare. The health of the planet, the healing of the planet is a care economy. Healing society and its fragmentations and ruptures and breakdowns is part of the care economy. There are no disposable or useless people. We are one humanity on one planet. Autonomy, meaning, dignity, work, freedom, democracy are our birthright. Thank you.
I would love to give the audience now all the open mics so you can hear the applause. I thank you very much, Vandana, for all the French speakers. Chapeau. Next on our list for the next input, I want to invite Bill McKibben to take the floor. You see only his name up to now on the screen. I already told you he has a low internet connection. Hi, Bill. Thank you for letting us see you for a second. And I would ask you for your input. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to get to join here today, and what an extraordinary pleasure to get to be sandwiched in between two of the women that I most admire on the planet, Vandana and Amy. It's really fun for me to be with everybody on this panel. First thing to be said to the European Greens is many, many thanks for the work that people have done in European capitals this last week to raise up the fight for racial justice in America and around the world. Don't think for a minute that people haven't taken enormous heart from watching people in the streets in London, in Paris, in 1,000 in Berlin, and 1,000 other places. This is a moment of incredible struggle and incredible opportunity for change in the US, and we are so grateful to see it being understood on a kind of global level. So thank you for that. I want to talk for just a second about the lessons of both the current moment when it comes to racial justice and the COVID crisis for how we think going forward. Let me make just 3 points. The first is that we're in a moment when we're reminded that reality is indeed real. you know, it's easy on a planet where everybody sits behind screens all day and can shift and shape and edit and move things around to begin to lose track of reality. I've spent the 30 years that I've worked on climate change trying to remind people that chemistry and physics don't negotiate or compromise. The microbe has done the same thing for biology. It doesn't matter that our dumb president stands up and you know, fulminates about how it's all a hoax or it's going to go away or something. If the microbe says wear a mask, then wear a mask. That's how reality works, and it's good to be reminded of that. And that reality goes beyond science to sociology too. It's really important to be reminded exactly how linked all these questions are. I was writing this week about the ways in which, you know, our struggle around racial justice right now began this latest chapter with George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," as a police officer knelt on his neck. But, you know, people can't breathe for all kinds of reasons. And it's always the same people who don't get the chance to breathe. If you're in a community that's marked by police brutality, you're also almost certainly in a community that has a coal-fired power plant right nearby. The asthma rate for African Americans is 3 times that of the general population. And the same around the world. In Vandana's country, 2.5 million of the 5 million children in Delhi have irreversible lung damage simply from breathing the air every day. We simply have to deal with those realities. Second point, and it's a corollary about reality, sometimes you have to move fast. That's what reality calls for. We watched around the COVID crisis that the countries, mostly in Asia, that actually quickly reacted here got ahead of things. Countries like South Korea or Taiwan that just looked at the science and went to work, as opposed to countries like mine that engaged in fantasy and delay and hence ended up having to take more disruptive action and ended up with a huge pile of dead bodies as a result, or huge tragedy. The corollary to the climate crisis couldn't be clearer. In the same way that the US wasted February doing nothing, the world wasted the last 30 years because of the fossil fuel industry not responding to the climate crisis. So now we need to move with extraordinary speed, and we're past the point where we can avoid a lot of trauma. It's coming at us. Third point, maybe most important, is that this is the most powerful reminder that we've had of something that the Greens have been telling us from the beginning, which is that social solidarity really, really matters. You know, I've lived most of my life in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan, who told us that markets solved all problems, that our job was each to get individually rich, you know. Ronald Reagan's most famous laugh line in all his speeches was, "The 9 scariest words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" Ha ha ha. Turns out that the scariest words in any language are things like, "Sorry, we've run out of ventilators," or "The hillside behind your house is on fire," or "Your child was just killed by the police." And those are not things that one solves one person at a time. Those we only solve when we come together to do the kind of work we need to do. So one hopes that we will seize the opportunity that these crises present for making really big changes in our global zeitgeist, that this becomes a moment for remarkable redirection and change, because my reading of the science around climate change is this may be the last moment like that we get while we still have some time. We need to seize it, and I am so grateful to everybody on this call and in this movement who's doing that work. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bill, very much. And you know what I admire most, I think, in your work, Bill, is that after, I think, more than 30 years, you still stay optimistic and you still propose actions to change the world to better. And this is a big role model for me, and I think for many of us, just not to give up, even if there is, if there is pushbacks, major pushbacks. So now I want to invite to hold her speech, Amy Goodman. I already presented her in the beginning of the meeting. Amy, please give your contribution. The floor is yours.
Well, it's a great honor to be with you all here and to be with Vandana and Bill to talk about visions for a resilient future, which is why I want to talk about media and democracy. I don't know how many of you know Democracy Now! It's a daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour that broadcasts around the world at democracynow.org and on open channels and on public television and radio channels throughout the world, 1,400 stations. And I say that to say we can have a forum. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, the climate crisis, racial and economic inequality, LGBTQ rights, and so much more, with people speaking for themselves at that table. This is an absolutely critical moment to be having this discussion. I echo what Bill said about this moment in time. I'm talking to you from New York, one of the epicenters of the pandemic. We've broadcast every day through it, through the sirens of the ambulances, and through actually the echoes of seagulls, because we don't usually hear seagulls here in New York City, but when everyone locked down, the animals started to come out. But at the same time that we are dealing with this pandemic, we see that it is not equal. It doesn't hit people equally. The racial disparity is enormous. And in our country, they hardly kept records of this before. It is political just to understand how hard hit the Latino community is, and particularly the African-American community. So in the midst of this, when we thought it couldn't get any worse, when tens of thousands of people were dying just in this city alone, disproportionately poor and people of color. Then we have on Memorial Day, that day in the United States, which is honoring the war dead. It's another kind of war dead. And that is an African-American man named George Floyd, who is murdered by the Minneapolis police. 4 of them. One kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he gasped, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." He lay lifeless for close to 3 of those minutes. He was handcuffed throughout. They did not lift up the pressure. The reason we know this is because a 17-year-old girl filmed. Even as she was threatened, even as she has faced death threats to this day, she would not stop. She bore witness. And how important it is that we have media that is there on the ground, no longer just your corporate gatekeepers of the commercial TV networks and newspapers that are brought to you by the very same corporations that grassroots organizations have been taking on for so long. Right? We are a network. We are a TV and radio broadcast, Democracy Now! That's not brought to you by the oil, the gas, the coal companies when we cover the climate crisis. That's not brought to you by the weapons manufacturers when we cover war and peace. That's not brought to you by the banks and the financial institutions when we cover inequality, and not brought to you by the insurance industry and big pharma, the drug companies, when we cover the healthcare crisis, not only in this country, but around the world. So we saw how these 2 pandemics, these 2 plagues, the plague of the coronavirus and the plague of racism, come together, and they have just unleashed a mighty torrent of debate, of response, of uprising all over the world. Democracy Now! Came out of Pacifica Radio, which is the oldest independent media radio network in the United States. We have 5 radio stations, and one of them in Houston, Texas, in the Petro Metro. When it went on the air in 1970, the Pacifica station there, within weeks it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew the station to smithereens. They got back on the air a few weeks later. They then strapped 15 times the dynamite, the Klan, the racist white hate group, and they blew it up again. It took months then, but in January of 1971, they rebuilt. The Phoenix rose from the ashes, and Pacifica Radio continued not only in Houston, but in New York and Washington, Los Angeles, in Berkeley, California. And it is that tradition that we grew out of. There's a reason why. I can't remember if he was called the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. I confuse their titles sometimes. But he said it was his proudest act because he understood how dangerous independent media is. And this is why I always want people to consider media as critical to the movements all over the world. Because when we have a media that is open and brought to you by the listeners, the viewers, the readers, and not by the corporations, not with a corporate agenda, we can have those honest, authentic discussions, and people can speak for themselves. And it's that language, both from the streets and from the scientists, from the doctors, the nurses, the artists, the unemployed and the employed, from organizers all over, hearing those voices, whether it's a Palestinian child or an uncle in Yemen, whether it's an aunt in Afghanistan or a teenager on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota with her standoff against the Dakota Access Pipeline. When you hear these voices, you say, my God, that person, that child, that aunt, that uncle sounds like my uncle, my aunt. And the difference is, we are able to speak through each other, to each other through them. And we see people's humanity, and it breaks down the caricatures and the stereotypes that fuel these hate groups. And that is what is so critical today. Whether we're talking about the pandemic of the coronavirus or of racism and police violence that people have risen up around the world against, we need to be able to see the reality on the ground. Facts matter. Here, Bill and I are speaking to you from the United States, where the president of the United States just announced he's going to be giving his first campaign rally since the beginning of the pandemic in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 19th. It's a sacred day for African Americans. June 19th, Juneteenth, it's called. June 19th, 1865, when enslaved people in Texas learned 2 years after President Lincoln unveiled the Emancipation Proclamation, they learned that they were free. That day, Juneteenth, is the day that President Trump has chosen to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma. This month, 99 years ago, one of the worst race massacres in this country, when on what was known as Black Wall Street of America in Tulsa, Oklahoma, African Americans were killed by the hundreds by white lynching mobs. This is the day that Trump decides to go to Tulsa, where a police captain in Tulsa just announced on the radio that if you look at the crime figures, he doesn't think the police have shot enough blacks, he said. We need to be able to ensure people's security through a pandemic like the coronavirus, through the climate crisis in the world today, when the Arctic, excuse that I use Fahrenheit, is now experiencing temperatures of 86 degrees Fahrenheit. It is absolutely critical to connect these issues simply by talking about facts. And in the White House, we have a president who denies those facts, whether we're talking about the science of the pandemic or the science of the climate crisis. All to he thinks personal gain, but he knows he is lying, because at this rally he's going to hold in Tulsa, He is making people sign off that they will not sue the Trump campaign if they get the coronavirus at his rally. He's demanding rallies where people don't wear masks, where people don't socially distance, but then he says, you can't sue us if you get sick. He understands. Our job is to expose the lies. Our job in the media, independent media all over the world, I encourage people to get Democracy Now! On their channels. Anyone can run us, but more than Democracy Now! At democracynow.org is building your own media where we can see the images, where we can hear people speak for themselves, where we can challenge the lies and hold those in power accountable. It's why today we spent the hour with Angela Davis, the Black liberation icon, the professor, the public intellectual, the activist, as she talked about defunding the police, a movement she has been a part of for years called Critical Resistance. As she talks about abolition, she talks about abolition of prisons. And why and how does this relate to the climate crisis and the pandemic? Because they're talking about reallocating funds for a Green New Deal all over the world, but to take that money from what has been traditionally thought of as enforcing security, poured into police departments, where they use tear gas and pepper spray, these chemicals that compromise the respiratory system that is the very place that gets hit so hard by the coronavirus, where she talks about reallocating, and so many in the Black Lives Matter movement are talking about reallocating the funds to a more healthy society, to a more resilient society, to a new world. That is the silver lining, if there is possibly one at all, in the pandemic. And that is, we see all over the world that we are connected. That if Donald Trump chooses to pull the world out of the World Health Organization, that we will also be hurting ourselves. I don't just think in terms of self-interest, and I don't think most of humanity does. But if he does, just looking at it from the point of view of what will protect us, it means protecting everyone. Because if one of us is infected, ultimately we all will be. I just want to thank the organizers for this event and talk about and end just with the idea that we must join together. And media is a great way to do that, because I really do think that those who are most concerned about war and peace, those who are most concerned about the climate crisis and inequality, racial and economic justice, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back and continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Amy. Big shout out to the work you and your partner, Dennis Moynihan, have been doing all these years and keep on doing. And thank you very much for your very clear message. You have taken some more time, but it was just fantastic to listen to you, member of the Parliament, of the European Parliament, former co-chair of European Greens, and former policy expert. Reinhard, the floor is yours.
Hi, Tom. Welcome to everybody who's following this conversation. I'm particularly happy to be sharing this panel with Vandana, Bill, Amy, and Nilaria. And I would like to put my focus on developments in the arena of international relations and look at how they are affected by the COVID-19 crisis. I would say that we do, in that regard, live through a very transformative period, but it's not yet clear in which direction that transformation will lead us. Obviously, under the spell of the pandemic, all kinds of conflicts escalate, but no conflict is probably more central and more relevant than the escalation of the hegemonic battle between the United States and China, in which they try to enwrap the whole world. It's the crisis, if you think back, never ever over the last, I don't know how many 100 years, has China played such a central role on a global scale for any important crisis. And it's also the first time in at least, I don't know, 50, 70 years that the US government doesn't even claim any responsibility for contributing to solving the crisis. And this, of course, has to do with very particular leaders that we see at the helm of these countries. On one side, we have the totalitarian Chinese leader who has closed every little space of free thinking and free speech and free self-organization. And on the other hand, we have the reckless, ruthless US president who hates every element of democracy that hems in his authoritarian tastes. And I think the real problem that is added on to the stress of the COVID-19 crisis is that these two hegemonic players play their game, pursue their game at the expense of everybody else. And some people in the EU and possibly also in other countries around the world increasingly get the impression that somehow we sit between a rock and a hard place, and there is fear spreading. And in addition, of course, there is the danger that the immediate need of crisis management and the immediate need of finding ways of exiting from this crisis might consume the necessary energies to find an adequate solution to this new type of challenge. I would, however, warn against allowing ourselves to be impressed completely by that perspective, and I would propose we take a different perspective. If we look at the wider world, we see that there is much more than old hegemon from Washington and upcoming hegemon from Beijing, and a European Union that, at least in with regard to trade, is also a global power. There are many other countries, there are many other parts of the world that should also be considered as players, as actors that deserve and want and merit agency. And I think for us, from a European green point of view, it would be of utmost importance that we find ways of teaming up with these people, of teaming up with the people in Africa or in the Middle East or in Latin America that are hit now more by the COVID-19 crisis than any European country has been, or the people that suffer most from climate change, or the people that have not just recently been living under authoritarian rulers deprived of any basic freedom, human rights or women's rights, or the people that are suffering from the persistent lack of international justice. I believe that the EU should, and this is our green task, devise a way of partnering with international partners to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, but at the same time addressing the more fundamental crises that still persist and that haven't gone away. And of course, that includes trade fairness, that includes green transformation, that includes human rights and fighting against racism that is taking its toll all around the world. So I would argue that counter to some of the public perception, the real issue is not whether this is a Chinese world or an American world or a self-centered European world, it is important to understand that this is now the time to build new alliances to change the world. In some regard, the political scientists who predicted that there might be a G0 world, a world with no leadership, have been proven right. You could say in the present situation, there isn't really good international leadership, but we cannot sit back and resign. So I think what we should do is start initiatives in order to build new alliances, global alliances for democracy and human rights, global alliances for international justice, for fighting climate change, and also for defending multilateralism. And when I say defending multilateralism, I'm not nostalgic, because I know that the old multilateralism didn't offer all that much for the countries of the global south, for instance. So I would talk about a multilateralism 2.0, but it is still a much better global governance system than the return to big power confrontation. The question is, of course, whether the EU would at all be able to help building such alliances. And when we look back over the last month, you could really doubt that, because in the beginning, it was around Europe an approach of every nation for themselves, everybody on their own. We had the huge, still have, where in particular the French and the Germans, the huge blemish of banning PPE exports when our neighbors needed that the most. And we also were not really strong enough in fighting authoritarianism, for instance, in the Hungarian appearance. I would still say that Europe, when there was the minute when everybody started beginning to fear that the European project would crack apart, Europe looked into the abyss and turned back. And the fact that we have been able now to agree in the European Parliament on ambitious plans for fighting the crisis and fighting for a good green exit from the crisis is a fact that gives us hope. We have seen that in a time of a major crisis, we still can cook up the energy to overcome it and to find new avenues forward. I would say that this new initiative is possible particularly because the old hegemonic power, the United States, is in the state in which it is, which is characterized most exactly by the demonstrations that we see all around that nation presently, and because the new hegemonic player, the Chinese, are not yet strong enough to take over. So we should use this hour for building a new international system of alliances. And it is important that we not bury our noses in the problems that are immediately ahead of us, but that we understand that we will only win our fights if we win them together globally. So whether it's George Floyd in Minnesota or the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or the Democrats in Hong Kong that are being oppressed, that's all our fight. And I think we should never forget that. So I think one of the answers is indeed, and we've been saying that often in the past, it's not a new gospel, but there are now new opportunities, I would argue. The strategy has to say we are in favor of globalizing progressive movements, and we have heard from movements that have done that successfully. The divestment movement that Bill stands for has globalized beautifully, or the anti-racism movement just recently, globalized beautifully. So I think we should not be timid. We should not believe in the inevitability of a triumph of oppressive systems. That's a lie. I think we should go back to Gramsci and learn one very important lesson from him when he said that what drives us forward should be the optimism of will. That's what counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Reinhard, for your profound views and for your motivating conclusions and words. Thank you very much for that. We have now the opportunity for our audience to raise some questions to our speakers. I would take one question first, which I would like to allocate to Bill first and invite all the others to contribute if they like to do so. Bill, what's your perception? Does this crisis experience raise the readiness within our society to react, to change consumption, to change policies, to change the extractive fossil model of economy? Do you see that happening in society? Bill, please.
Well, that's very much the crucial question. And I think that there's a lot of different cross-cutting things going on here. First of all, it clearly demonstrates that we're capable of very rapid change. I don't think if you told anyone a year ago that we were going to, lock down the world's economy. I mean, I don't know anyone who's been on an airplane in many months. People would have laughed at that. And as it turns out, human beings are capable of rapid change. This is the biggest disruption of most of our lifetimes. And we've dealt with it to one degree or another. And that's powerful. One of the things that's happened, of course, is that emissions have gone down in the course of doing that. And that's a good reminder of how important individual habits and lifestyles are in driving these questions, driving these emissions. On the other hand, what's also interesting is that they only went down about 10 or 15%, which is a good indication that along with lifestyle change, we're going to have to do a lot of other things. So much of our emissions are hardwired into the system around us, it turns out. And so we're going to have to get into the guts of those systems and really make some big change. We're going to have to put in a lot of conservation, a lot of insulation, a lot of sun and wind to replace the coal and gas and oil and overconsumption that's there now. I think what's going to be interesting is how as Vandana pointed out, the huge impacts of the COVID crisis are, one of them is going to be the huge economic turmoil and damage that it leaves behind. And so how do we react to that? We're obviously going to have to react in some way. And the question is, do we try to return to something that looked like the old normal, or do we use this moment to try and deal with the other crises that are facing us too? And I think in that answer to that question is really, I think this may be one of our last chances as societies to grapple with the climate crisis while we still have time. So the work the economic response to the COVID crisis, if it looks something like a global Green New Deal, will allow us to make rapid change. It may be the last moment we get to make that kind of rapid change, the last big opportunity. That's why it's so encouraging to see so many European countries at least flirting with that possibility. And that's, of course, why it's so discouraging to see the United States just doubling down on old ways of doing business. Thank heaven we have an election coming up, so maybe we can get rid of the single worst leader we've ever had and make some progress, because that's the question. Can we use this as a springboard for powerful change, or is the human impulse to try and return to some kind of normal going to triumph, even if that old normal was a crisis in and of itself?
Thank you, Bill. Vandana, do you want to contribute to that question? Were you on the brink to take the floor? Then please do so, if you like to. Vandana, can you hear me still? You have to unmute yourself first, please.
Yeah. On the same issue, I think, we're working with three boundary conditions. There's the boundary conditions of the planet at the planetary level. There's the boundary conditions of a food system that is, on the one hand, creating huge disease pandemics and chronic diseases, but is also pushing at least 1/7 of humanity to hunger and maybe starvation. And then the third is the right to work. For the first time, not only do we have a pandemic that shut the economy down and large numbers have lost their livelihoods, but we actually have the tech giants talking about an economy in the future where they won't need people. And my country signing day by day, half of India was kind of thrown away. People who worked in the cities, I don't know how within a country they've started calling them migrant labor. They were dispossessed farmers who became urban workers. Everywhere they're talking of automation. And everywhere, of course, is digitalization. New York signed an agreement with Bill Gates. They're saying, why do we need schools? Temporary measure of a pandemic management turned into a permanent measure of no teachers, no schools. When we think of that and we think of Zuckerberg saying the future, 99% human beings will be useless. So between a planet that some people think is disposable, our dear Elon Musk tried to, sex on the 31st in the peak of all these protests. He wants to escape. And he says, the only alternative to extinction is escape. And I said, no, the third most important alternative is stay home and take care of the earth and let everyone have a place in this common home with life and livelihoods. And I think I would just add to what Bill said. I don't think it's only energy. As I gave the details on how 50% come from a fossil fuel-based industrial system. We are literally eating oil. 10 units of energy are used to produce 1 unit of food. And now they want fake food. They want GMO-based soya with GMO enzymes and yeast, creating factory food and saying farming without farmers, food without farms. And that means an end to work. So I don't think we can get rid of any of these three boundary conditions. That to me is the Green New Deal. And I plead with the Greens to make a truly Green New Deal that works according to the laws of the earth, the laws of justice, the laws of peace, and not along how can some people make more money, because that financialization and World Economic Forum is, of course, wanting to find new ways to make money out of nature.
Sure. Point taken. We do our best, I can guarantee you. I have a question here coming from Hungary, from Gabor, which is actually pointing on the question of Russian influence in terms of fake news, but also influencing other news channels. And I would like to point that question to Amy first and then to Reinhard next. Give us your views on that question, if you can, please. You have to unmute yourself, Amy. Unmute yourself, please.
I would like to hear what Reinhard has to say first, and then I'll comment.
Okay, Reinhard.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you, Gabor, for your question. I must say that Russia is, Russia means Putin. I mean, it's not the Russian people, it's the authoritarian leadership, but in that sense, Russia is playing this very opportunistically. I am afraid that President Putin, between when he left office after his first term as president and when he returned for his new term as president during the Medvedev interim, decided that he was going to change course with regard to Russia's international relations. He had advocated modernizing Russia with the help of Western cooperation. And he had looked in particular to countries like Germany, and Germany had been more than willing to play ball. But at some point, I would analyze, he decided that really transforming the Russian economy into a modern economy would have so big destabilizing effects on his centralized control of the country that he would rather sacrifice an economic modernization, including digital modernization, including environmental modernization, climate modernization. He would rather sacrifice that and rely on a resource-intense economy. So basically, he has built a resource-dependent state, and for that, he did not need cooperation, so he turned against Europe. And ever since, he has played a game which has tried to undermine European cohesion. Russia, for many years, was favorable to the European Union. This is not anymore the case. They are trying to play a very strong game of divide and conquer. In that regard, they're not so different from Xi Jinping or President Trump. They are using whatever they can to undermine the cohesion of the European system. And the goal that Russia pursues with that is, I think, very simple. Russia today is a revisionist power. The Russian government believes that Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent country, nor does Georgia, nor do the Baltic countries. They're just not saying that as loudly as they do say it with regard to Ukraine. And I believe that Putin is a very good poker player. I don't think he's a great strategist, but he's a very good poker player, and he is willing to take risk, and he's willing to find opportunity to reestablish Russia in a role that it didn't play after the Soviet Union was abandoned. So I think it's very difficult to cooperate with this regime, even though, I mean, they are our neighbors. They will not move away, nor will we. So we will have to look for opportunities of working with them, but I think it's very complicated.
Thank you, Reinhard. May I hand over to Amy?
Yes, I would just add that we have to be concerned about misinformation from anywhere, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's the United States, whether it's corporations. And, you know, this is why independent media is so important. In the United States now, the debate, because of the level and the power of President Trump's lies, are the pressure on corporations like Twitter and Facebook to mark them as lies, as falsehoods, and to send you to the correct information. But I don't think corporations are the arbiters of what is true. We need a public square that is not controlled by corporations. That's what I would do.
Say this again, please.
Thank you, Amy. Reinhard, you have to unmute yourself if you take phone calls in between. Otherwise, we can listen to you. Thank you very much, Amy. I have another question that comes from Charles from Sweden. And the question is, what do you think are the implications that come from the COVID crisis on global trade and trade regimes? And what would be the implications that we should actually support or try to put in place? And that question goes to first to Vandana and then back to Ryan.
We will do this today. Okay.
I think like everything else, the future is really multiple parts. And while in an obvious sense, the corona pandemic and the lockdown have shut down globalization and have shut down definitely the global food chains, unfortunately, they have also created a new opportunity for the richest man in the world through e-commerce. And I have watched in my country as well as other countries how new concessions have been given to Amazon. And Jeff Bezos became richer by 34 billion in this short period of lockdown. And the billionaires in America got richer by 34 billion in this period. The two worries for me is, even though the lockdown has taught us that the most reliable systems for resilience, health resilience, democratic resilience, political resilience, economic resilience, climate resilience, biodiversity rejuvenation, are local, biodiverse, organic systems. And I'm very glad Europe now has the farm to fork policy on which you can build a lot. But 50% reduction in pesticides is a very low level ambition. We should be going for 100%, getting rid of war chemicals, because they do no one any good, not to the insects, not to the bees, not to our health. Cancer is one of the biggest killers in the world. Even though this is the lesson, big tech, big biotech, big finance, big agribusiness are joining up, as I mentioned, on farming without farmers, digital agriculture, drones and tractorless drivers, larger and larger farms, because you can't do that kind of agriculture on biodiverse small farms, and wanting food that's no more food. And the piece they are missing is the link between the soil, the biodiversity, the food, and our health. All my research in the last few years has shown that health is a continuum through biodiversity. And while you can cheat consumers on supermarket shelves, you can't cheat the 60 trillion gut microbiomes. So health is the health of the microbiome. It's created by healthy soils, healthy biodiversity, and you can only grow biodiversity when your systems are decentralized and localized. So that 30 things a local community needs, or 150 things a local town needs, gets supplied from a food shed. That shift from monocultures to biodiversity, from fossil fuels and agri-chemicals to biodiversity performing ecological functions to control weeds, to control pests, to rejuvenate soil fertility, that is scientifically established now. And Ilaria talked about circular health. Circular health means circular local food economies. And long distance transport on fake food with lots of energy intensity mean lots of more emissions, lots of energy use, and lots of sickness and disease. Of course, for the giants, it works fine, because the same companies that sell us GMOs and agri-chemicals are also the pharmaceutical companies that sell us the treatment. And for them, this is a perpetual motion market machine. We need to turn it into an ecological system that is able to regenerate itself perennially, including every human being who's part of all the systems, including our planet Earth.
Thank you, Vandana. Reinhard, are you still around? Then I would pass on that question to you, maybe from an EU perspective. What's your conclusions on how shall we change our trade policy in the light of this COVID crisis? Please take the floor.
Sure, I'm here. Thank you. I think that the two most important changes that we have to get enacted are, on one hand, to human rights proof our trade, and the second is to make labor and environmental standards effectively enforceable in trade agreements. We've called for both these changes for a long time. We were on the cusp of finding agreement with regard to the second dimension at the beginning of this legislative period, and then other groups withdrew from that proposition. With regards to the human rights dimension, I think we're doing better at the moment because, Anna Cavazzini or Heidi Hautala, our main trade people, could tell you much more about that than I can, but we have been successful in convincing also Commission, in particular Commissioners Reinders and Hogan, that there should be a human rights proofing mechanism for the supply chains of business. And if we keep pushing, and I think it's a success that we're at this point right now, a success that we share with many NGOs. If we keep pushing, we might have such a system next year, and that would mark a great progress. Because, of course, that would allow us to address issues like the exploitation of forced Uyghur labor in China, or the exploitation of young people by fishermen in Southeast Asia, or whatever kind of exploitation you have, even in the meat business in our own country, where we have a similarly desperate situation that has long been ignored. So I think these would be the two most important practical steps.
Could I just come in to say that the WTO turned food into a commodity, which is why we have chronic disease pandemics and infectious disease pandemics. We also have the destruction of biodiversity and the destruction of small farmers. Just look at the data of the disappearance of small farmers in Europe. I think it's time to reclaim food as health. That is the circular economy of health. And food as health means local town councils start to get the power to make decisions about whether to ban glyphosate or not, whether to ban pesticides or not. So food should become health, recognized in law, and therefore not have the right of corporations to push chemicals, pesticides, toxic food, junk food, and treat that as a like product, because an unhealthy toxic product is not a like product to a healthy product that gives you health. The definition of like product must be revisited in the trade rules.
I'm not sure whether you agree or disagree, Vandana, but let me make this one point. With regard to the WTO, we have been criticizing that for decades. And now we find that there is something much worse than the WTO, which is the return to the big power game of might makes right. And look at what Donald Trump does in his trade policy. He ignores all the rules that might apply for weaker countries do not apply certainly for the United States. And I think we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. I don't think that the WTO is where we would want to have an international trade organization. But getting rid of the WTO is not making it better, it's making it worse. So I think we have to fight a dual fight. One, to hold on to multilateralism and to improve it, and then to use it to substantially make advances in the direction of the criteria that you have argued.
I totally agree with you. I think defending multilateralism in everything is vital. And definitely the robber barons ruling the world should not be allowed. And I think Europe and the European Green should play a role in preventing the plurilateral agreement that's being shaped, where the barons are also using WTO, where they want a new digital free trade with no governments having any say to prevent surveillance, invasion into privacy. And that, I think, is a very important piece, because countries like mine have refused to participate in this plurilateral agreement. But I think Europe is in it, and Europe could play a very big balancing role.
Thank you, Vandana. You're actually opening also a new debate around taxation of digital companies, which we discussed a lot also in the European Parliament. Thank you for also having that conversation. I think it's not a contradiction. I think we need both. Allow me to forward a last question due to time constraints to Bill. Bill, there's a question towards meat consumption and meat production. And isn't this linked to a COVID crisis and climate crisis at the same time? And what's your position towards it, or what would you propose we should negotiate for?
Well, it clearly is linked in all kinds of ways. And this is, one more good reminder, A, that we should be eating lower on the food chain, and B, that along with thinking about our own individual consumption, we better start figuring out how to, as several people have been saying, Ilaria and Vandana among them, how we organize food production on this planet. Because in the United States, one of the absolute vectors for sharing COVID has been these giant slaughterhouses that, are inhumane, are uneconomic, are wrong in every way. And it also turns out they're a tremendous vector for humans spreading disease. So I think among the many things that we're waking up to as a result of the COVID thing is the idea that there are even more things wrong with industrial meat production than we thought. And that as we move towards a more localized food system, that'll be one of the great advantages.
And I would just like to add on that issue is of the whole slaughterhouse supply chain, really focus on the workers in those plants, as Bill just alluded to. Thousands and thousands and thousands of mainly immigrant people of color work in these slaughterhouses. And they did not get the proper gear at the beginning. They cannot maintain socially, distant workplaces. It just highlights the fissures the pandemic does in so many ways of how so-called essential workers have become synonymous in this country, in the United States, with expendable workers. And that is certainly highlighted in the meat plants of the United States.
Amen. Exactly right.
Thank you very much for that answer. As we're running out of time, I have to start to close that session with a big shout out and a big thank you to Vandana Shiva from India, to Bill McKibben from US, to Amy Goodman from Worldwide Democracy Now!, to Reinhard Bütikofer, who we all know and can access regularly, and also to Miss Ilaria Capua, who had to leave us already. Thank you very much for participating in this exchange. Amy, yes.
No, just
yes.
wishing you peace and everyone to stay safe.
Stay safe and stay combative.
We didn't hear Vandana now. I have to make some announcements here, and the announcements are, please stay for a moment. The next panel is going to start in 30 minutes with the speakers of Franziska Brandner, MP from Germany, Leonore Gewesela, Minister of Climate Action from the Greens, Energy and Mobility in Austria, Małgorzata Trac, Polish Greens, made it to the National Parliament, to the Sejm finally, and she's a member there, and Virginius Sinkevikos, who is a green-minded and from a Green Party stemming Commissioner on Environment in the European Commission. they will have the next platform. Later on, we will have a concert with Lisa Hannigan on the platform at 20:30. And please join us on Zoom for all together for a brief photo action to support the Black Lives Matter movement. Please wear black, and if you can, hold a sign that says Black Lives Matter. Let's send a strong signal, not only to the US, where there's a major uprising, but also to all our European and EU countries, where we also face racism on a daily basis. Please join us on that Zoom link. I hope you're all joining us in a moment. Thank you for participating in this fantastic panel, and see you in a moment.